What if the greatest leaders in American history weren't defined by their victories, but by the failures they endured first? What if the moments that seemed like their lowest points were actually the stepping stones to their greatest achievements? And what if the stories we admire most aren't about unbroken success, but about resilience forged in the fire of defeat? History has a way of polishing legacies until all we see are the triumphs. We remember the speeches, the victories, the milestones. But behind every headline achievement is a hidden story of setbacks. The leaders who shaped America, politicians, activists, visionaries, were not strangers to failure. In fact, failure was often their teacher. It humbled them, clarified their mission, and gave them the resilience to keep pushing when the odds seemed impossible. Their examples remind us that the path to greatness is never straight. It is littered with defeats that test the spirit and force leaders to grow. Take Abraham Lincoln, one of the most revered figures in American history. Today, he is remembered as the president who preserved the Union and ended slavery. But before his presidency, Lincoln's life was filled with failures. He lost multiple elections, faced business collapse, and even battled deep depression. By most accounts, he should have given up on politics. But instead, each failure became part of his preparation. Losing elections taught him persistence. Facing personal despair gave him empathy for the struggles of others. These setbacks shaped the resilience he would need during the Civil War, a time when the nation teetered on the edge of destruction. Without failure, Lincoln's legacy might never have been written. Consider Franklin D. Roosevelt, who became president during the Great Depression and later led the US through World War II. His leadership reshaped American society, creating programs that provided security for generations. But before he reached the presidency, Roosevelt faced his own devastating setback, polio. The disease left him paralyzed from the waist down. For many, this would have ended a political career. Yet Roosevelt refused to let it define him. He fought through physical and emotional pain, developing extraordinary resilience and empathy. His experience with hardship made him a leader who connected deeply with struggling Americans. His famous fireside chats weren't just political tools. They were the words of someone who knew what it felt like to suffer. Roosevelt's setback didn't weaken him. It became the very thing that made his leadership strong. Then there's Martin Luther King Jr., whose leadership in the Civil Rights Movement changed the course of American history. His speeches and marches are celebrated worldwide, but what's often forgotten are the countless failures he faced. He was arrested over 20 times, threatened constantly, and met with setbacks in campaigns that didn't achieve immediate results. Yet King never let failure silence him. Instead, he drew strength from each setback, believing that justice was worth the struggle. His "I have a dream" speech wasn't delivered from a place of unbroken success. It was born from years of disappointment and perseverance. King's failures fueled his moral authority, showing the world that resilience in the face of injustice is itself a victory. Failure also shaped leaders in unexpected arenas, like business and innovation. Consider Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Today, he is remembered as a visionary who transformed technology. But in 1985, Jobs was fired from the very company he created. The humiliation could have ended his career. Instead, he used the setback as fuel. He founded Next, invested in Pixar, and developed new ideas that would later revive Apple when he returned in the late 1990s. Jobs often said that getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to him because it freed him to think creatively again. His story demonstrates that even the most humiliating defeats can prepare leaders for their greatest contributions. Another powerful example is Oprah Winfrey, a cultural icon and media leader. Today, Oprah is celebrated as one of the most influential women in the world. But early in her career, she was fired from her job as a television news anchor because her bosses thought she wasn't right for TV. Instead of giving up, she turned that rejection into motivation. She found her unique voice, eventually building her own media empire. Oprah's resilience turned a setback into a platform for inspiring millions. Her story shows that failure is not the opposite of success, it is often the path to it. American leaders across different fields share this pattern: failure, persistence, and eventual triumph. Thomas Edison, whose inventions shaped modern life, famously failed thousands of times before creating a successful light bulb. He reframed failure as discovery, saying, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." His mindset exemplifies resilience, seeing each failure not as defeat but as progress. Even political figures like Theodore Roosevelt embraced failure as part of leadership. Before becoming president, Roosevelt experienced personal tragedy when both his wife and mother died on the same day. Crushed by grief, he withdrew from politics temporarily. But rather than remain broken, he rebuilt himself. He spent years in the Badlands of North Dakota, testing his strength against the harsh wilderness. That period of setback and renewal gave him the grit and vitality that defined his presidency. His famous "Man in the Arena" speech reflected this truth. The credit belongs not to those who avoid failure, but to those who dare greatly, even if they stumble. One striking aspect of all these stories is how failure shaped not only leaders' external achievements, but their internal character. Failure taught Lincoln compassion, Roosevelt perseverance, King courage, Jobs innovation, Oprah authenticity, Edison determination, and Theodore Roosevelt grit. These qualities didn't come from success alone, they were forged in moments of loss. Psychology confirms this. Setbacks, when faced with resilience, build traits like empathy, adaptability, and focus. These traits, more than raw talent, define great leaders. Why do we admire these stories so much? Because they mirror our own struggles. Everyone knows what it feels like to fall short. When we see leaders rise after failure, it gives us hope that we can too. Their resilience becomes a mirror reflecting our own potential. They remind us that greatness isn't about avoiding failure, it's about refusing to quit after it. Moreover, their examples provide practical lessons. Lincoln teaches us to persist despite repeated rejection. Roosevelt shows us how physical and emotional setbacks can deepen empathy. King demonstrates that setbacks in the pursuit of justice can strengthen moral resolve. Jobs shows that even humiliation can lead to reinvention. Oprah proves that rejection can be redirection. Edison reminds us that failure is just feedback. Theodore Roosevelt inspires us to embrace struggle as a test of character. These lessons apply to politics, business, relationships, and personal growth alike. Failure also humanizes leaders. It's easy to see them as larger-than-life figures, but their setbacks remind us they were human too. They doubted, they stumbled, they suffered. What sets them apart is not immunity to failure, but resilience through it. And that resilience is available to all of us. In the broader American story, failure itself is woven into the national identity. The nation was built through trial and error, setbacks and recoveries. The spirit of resilience, of turning defeat into motivation, is part of what defines the US. This cultural backdrop makes the stories of American leaders especially powerful. Their personal resilience reflects the collective resilience of a people who have faced wars, depressions, and crises, but always found ways to rise. So, when we study famous US leaders who failed before they won, we're not just studying history, we're studying resilience in action. We're seeing proof that setbacks are not the end, but the beginning of growth. We're learning that failure is not a signal to stop, but an invitation to start again, this time with greater wisdom. And perhaps the most inspiring truth of all is this: the leaders who failed before they won didn't know in the moment that they were on the path to greatness. To them, it just felt like pain, rejection, or loss. It was only later, with persistence, that those setbacks revealed themselves as fuel. That means the same could be true for us. The setbacks we're facing right now may be the very experiences preparing us for our greatest achievements. The lesson is simple but profound. Failure is not final. It is formative. Every setback has the potential to become the seed of success if we choose to learn, adapt, and persist. The lives of America's greatest leaders prove it, and our own lives can too. When we think about leadership, it's tempting to imagine a straight road paved with victories, promotions, and applause. But history and psychology tell a different story. The path to greatness almost always runs through valleys of failure. The most famous leaders in US history didn't avoid these valleys. They walked straight through them, sometimes stumbling, sometimes crawling, but always moving forward. Their setbacks didn't erase their potential, they refined it. And in part 2 of this exploration, We'll take a closer look at how these failures played out, how leaders responded in the moment, and what specific lessons they left behind for us today. Let's return first to Abraham Lincoln. Before becoming the 16th President of the United States, Lincoln was no stranger to loss. He failed in business, leaving him with significant debt that took years to repay. He lost multiple runs for the state legislature, for Congress, and even for the Senate. For many, repeated political failure would have been reason enough to quit. But Lincoln reframed each loss not as a final judgment, but as an education. He learned how to connect with voters, how to refine his message, and how to sharpen his legal and political skills. These lessons would become invaluable when he eventually faced the monumental crisis of the Civil War. Lincoln's failures remind us that setbacks can serve as rehearsals for larger responsibilities. Without the practice of losing, he might never have had the resilience to guide a fractured nation through its darkest hour. Franklin D. Roosevelt's story reveals another dimension of resilience, transforming personal pain into public empathy. Before becoming president, Roosevelt contracted polio, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. At a time when disability was stigmatized and often hidden, this could have ended his career. Instead, Roosevelt redefined himself. He learned to project strength, not by denying his condition, but by demonstrating courage in spite of it. His long battle with illness gave him a unique understanding of suffering, which he carried into his presidency during the Great Depression. When he spoke to Americans in his fireside chats, it wasn't just a politician delivering words. It was a man who knew firsthand what it meant to struggle and to hope. Roosevelt's story illustrates how leaders can transform private defeats into public strength, turning pain into compassion and setbacks into empathy. Martin Luther King Jr. offers yet another example of resilience shaped by failure. The civil rights movement was filled with setbacks, boycotts that didn't gain traction, marches that ended in violence, court cases that were lost. King himself faced constant threats, arrests, and criticisms, even from within his own community. Each failure could have broken his resolve. But King understood that setbacks were not signs of defeat. They were milestones on a longer journey toward justice. He drew motivation from the failures, using them as proof that the struggle was worth continuing. His persistence turned what seemed like endless obstacles into fuel for a movement that eventually changed the fabric of American society. King's life reminds us that setbacks often accompany the most meaningful missions. The greater the cause, the greater the resistance, and the greater the need for resilience. Business and innovation leaders, too, have lived out this pattern. Consider Steve Jobs. When Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985, it was more than a career setback. It was a personal humiliation. Fired from his own company, he was seen by many as a cautionary tale of arrogance and failure. But Jobs refused to let the story end there. He founded Next, invested in Pixar, and continued to innovate. These ventures taught him lessons about leadership, design, and patience that he lacked in his early years. When Apple eventually brought him back, he returned wiser and more disciplined, leading the company into a golden era of creativity with products like the iMac, iPod, iPhone, and iPad. Jobs' firing wasn't the end of his story, it was the turning point. It stripped away his ego and gave him the humility needed to lead Apple into the future. Oprah Winfrey's journey also demonstrates how rejection can be transformed into reinvention. Early in her career, Oprah was fired from her job as a news anchor. Her bosses said she wasn't fit for television. That setback could have destroyed her confidence. Instead, she embraced her authentic style, eventually creating a new form of talk show that blended empathy, vulnerability, and inspiration. This unique approach made her one of the most influential media leaders in history. Oprah's story underscores a crucial lesson. Sometimes failure is not a sign that you're in the wrong field. It's a sign that you're in the wrong role. Setbacks push us to realign with our strengths, and in doing so, they set us on a path toward authentic success. Thomas Edison provides a different perspective, one rooted in experimentation. Edison failed thousands of times while trying to invent the light bulb. Each failure wasn't a discouragement but a discovery, another way that didn't work. Edison famously said that he didn't fail, he just found 10,000 ways that wouldn't work. This mindset is at the heart of resilience, seeing setbacks not as dead ends but as data. In Edison's case, persistence in the face of repeated failure eventually illuminated the world, literally. His story demonstrates that setbacks, when approached with curiosity and persistence, are not barriers but building blocks of innovation. Theodore Roosevelt, too, embodies resilience shaped by tragedy. When both his wife and his mother died on the same day in 1884, Roosevelt was devastated. Overcome with grief, he withdrew from politics and moved to the Badlands of North Dakota. There, he immersed himself in the rugged life of ranching, hunting, and exploring. The experience toughened him physically and emotionally, restoring his spirit. When he eventually returned to politics, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. His famous Man in the Arena speech later reflected his own journey. Credit belongs to those who dare greatly, even if they fail, because their struggle itself defines their greatness. Roosevelt's story shows how personal setbacks can be transformed into tests of character that prepare leaders for public challenges. One of the striking similarities across all these stories is the role of resilience as a choice. None of these leaders were destined to bounce back. Each faced moments when quitting would have been easier, when despair seemed reasonable, when walking away looked like the only option. Yet they chose differently. They chose to see failure as feedback, to treat setbacks as training, and to persist even when the outcome was uncertain. Their choices made the difference between obscurity and greatness. Psychology helps explain why these stories resonate so deeply. Research on resilience shows that people who interpret setbacks as temporary, specific, and changeable are more likely to recover. Lincoln didn't see a lost election as permanent proof of failure. He saw it as one step on a longer road. Roosevelt didn't see polio as the end of his career. He reframed it as part of his story. Oprah didn't see being fired as a verdict on her ability. She saw it as redirection. Edison didn't see failed experiments as evidence of incompetence. He saw them as progress. Each of these interpretations turned setbacks into fuel. There's also a cultural dimension to these stories. American identity has long celebrated the comeback. From the frontier spirit to the civil rights struggle to Silicon Valley innovation, the idea of resilience is deeply embedded in the national psyche. Leaders who fail and then rise again embody this cultural narrative. They reflect the American belief that failure is not fatal, that anyone can start over, and that resilience is a defining trait of greatness. This cultural context both shapes and amplifies the power of their stories. For us today, the lessons are practical. We may not be presidents, inventors, or media moguls, but we all face setbacks. Maybe it's a failed exam, a lost job, a broken relationship, or a dream that didn't materialize. The leaders we've studied show us that these moments are not the end. They're invitations to grow. They teach us that failure is not a verdict, but a process. That setbacks are not barriers, but teachers. What matters is how we respond. Lincoln teaches persistence. Roosevelt teaches empathy. King teaches moral courage. Jobs teaches reinvention. Oprah teaches authenticity. Edison teaches persistence in experimentation. Theodore Roosevelt teaches grit in the face of tragedy. Each lesson is a piece of the resilience puzzle, and together they form a blueprint for turning setbacks into success. Ultimately, famous U.S. leaders who failed before they won remind us of a universal truth. Greatness is not about avoiding failure, it's about what you do after failure. The measure of a leader is not how many times they stumble, but how many times they rise. And if history is any guide, the setbacks we face today may be the very fuel for the victories of tomorrow. Failure is often painted as the opposite of success. But when we look at the lives of America's most influential leaders, we discover a very different truth. For them, failure was not the end of the road. It was the foundation upon which their eventual triumphs were built. In this third part of exploring famous US leaders who failed before they won, we turn our attention to the deeper psychology of resilience, the practical lessons that emerge from their struggles, and the ways we can apply these insights to our own lives. Because ultimately, the story of Lincoln, Roosevelt, King, Jobs, Oprah, Edison, and Theodore Roosevelt is not just about them, it's about all of us. Their setbacks mirror ours, and their resilience offers us a blueprint for our own comebacks. When Abraham Lincoln lost yet another Senate race in 1858, many thought his political career was over. Friends and rivals alike whispered that he had neither the charisma nor the connections to climb higher. Lincoln could have believed them, but instead he reframed his defeat as temporary. He doubled down on his mission, refined his arguments against slavery, and prepared himself for the national stage. Just 2 years later, he won the presidency. What does this tell us? That failure doesn't define you. Your response to it does. Lincoln's resilience wasn't born out of victory, it was forged in the furnace of rejection. Franklin D. Roosevelt's polio diagnosis robbed him of physical mobility, but sharpened his empathy and inner resolve. Struggling to walk, he learned to lean on others, not just physically, but emotionally. This humility prepared him to lead a broken nation during the Great Depression, when millions of Americans felt powerless. His setbacks didn't weaken him. They aligned him with the struggles of ordinary citizens. Roosevelt shows us that when life takes something away, it can also give us the ability to connect more deeply with others. Our own hardships, painful as they are, often give us the wisdom and compassion to help those around us. Martin Luther King Jr. endured repeated setbacks in his fight for civil rights, failed campaigns, violent opposition, betrayals from allies. Yet each defeat fueled his determination. Instead of asking, "Why me?" he asked, "What now?" He saw setbacks not as signs of failure, but as reminders that the road to justice is long and costly. This mindset allowed him to keep going when many would have given up. King's story challenges us to consider our own struggles. Do we allow setbacks to silence us, or do we use them as fuel to continue pursuing what matters most? Steve Jobs' exile from Apple was one of the most public failures in modern business history. Humiliated and discarded, he had every reason to disappear. But Jobs took that defeat and turned it into motivation. He poured his energy into Next and Pixar, sharpening his leadership skills and creative vision. When Apple asked him back, he returned transformed, ready to lead a revolution in technology. Jobs teaches us that sometimes failure isn't a punishment, it's preparation. The very season that feels like exile may be the season that equips us for our greatest calling. Oprah Winfrey's firing as a young news anchor could have shattered her confidence, but instead, it pushed her toward a path where her natural empathy and authenticity could shine. By turning rejection into redirection, she built one of the most successful media empires in history. Oprah's story reveals a vital truth. What looks like failure may actually be life, steering you toward your true gift. If one door closes, it might be because you were never meant to walk through it. You were meant to build your own. Thomas Edison's endless experiments and repeated failures remind us that setbacks are data, not disasters. Each failed light bulb wasn't wasted. It was a step closer to success. Edison's story captures the essence of resilience, persistence plus perspective. If we treat every setback as feedback, we can transform discouragement into discovery. The lesson here is simple but profound. The people who succeed are not the ones who never fail. They are the ones who never quit. Theodore Roosevelt's double tragedy, the death of his wife and mother on the same day, plunged him into despair. He withdrew to the rugged wilderness of the Badlands, where he rebuilt his spirit through struggle. That season of grief and resilience became the backbone of his man-in-the-arena philosophy, a call to embrace life fully, even at the risk of failure. Roosevelt teaches us that setbacks can strip us down to our core, but from that place of emptiness, we can rebuild stronger. What unites all of these leaders is not that they failed, but how they responded to failure. They chose resilience over retreat, purpose over despair, growth over bitterness. And psychology confirms what their stories demonstrate. Resilience is not just a personality trait, it is a practice. It's built every time we reframe failure, regulate our emotions, lean on support, and persist through difficulty. So how can we apply these lessons in our own lives? Start by reframing your setbacks. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" This shift turns pain into purpose. Second, embrace small wins. Don't expect an overnight comeback. Like Edison, stack small experiments and small improvements until they add up to success. Third, seek support. No leader bounced back alone. Lincoln had allies, Roosevelt had advisors, King had a movement, Jobs had creative teams, Oprah had mentors. Find your community. Finally, redefine success. Don't measure it solely by titles or trophies. Measure it by growth, by alignment with values, by resilience itself. Your setbacks may not be as dramatic as those of Lincoln or Oprah, but they matter. Maybe you failed a class, lost a job, endured heartbreak, or watched a dream collapse. Whatever it is, remember this. Failure is not fatal. It's formative. Each setback contains a lesson, and each lesson contains the fuel for your next step. The leaders who inspire us most didn't rise because they never fell. They rose because they refused to stay down. Here's the challenge I leave you with. Think of one setback you faced recently. Write it down. Then next to it, write the lesson it taught you. How can you use that lesson to fuel your next move? This simple act transforms a moment of failure into a source of strength. And if you practice this consistently, you will begin to see setbacks not as enemies, but as allies. And now, here is the call to action. If this message resonates with you, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Think Fresh Daily for more stories of resilience, growth, and transformation. Like this video to show your support for the idea that failure is not the end, but the beginning. Share it with someone who needs encouragement right now. Someone who is stuck in a setback and needs to hear that it can be fuel for their future. Because resilience is not just for presidents and icons, it's for all of us. Your failure is not your finish line, it is your training ground. And just like the leaders we've explored, you can rise stronger and wiser on the other side. The question is not whether you will face setbacks, the question is whether you will let them stop you or fuel you. Choose resilience, choose growth, choose to keep moving. The next chapter of your story is waiting to be written, and it will be defined not by your defeats, but by your decision to rise after them.